it's really challenging. And I don't mean just challenging because you get distracted. I mean, if you really get to this moment of pure beingness itself, it's terrifying. Because there's none of the things that otherwise the ego latches onto, to use a traditional lingo. The ego latches onto to get security. There's nothing. Nothing. How can an ego, meaning a sense of identity, exist when there's nothing to latch onto at all in or for the ego? I mean, all these identities and so on that I referenced, there's nothing left in the end but just being itself. And this is true of all existential being, or meaning sentient being, or the self-reflective subjectivity that I'm talking about here. This is its nature. This is what we're granted, a great gift, and thus you see also a terrible challenge, also a terrible curse, thus, because there's nothing that comes to say how to handle it. It just is. That's being. Though I'm suggesting that being itself, in its isness, is symbolic, like all human experience. And symbolicness is, by its nature, the generation of meaning, through the encounter of it, through being. So that there is, of course, an inherent answer in being to the problem of being, which is, of course, individuation. And as you well know, those of you who might have been into that or studied that notion of individuation, it is a great journey of transformation which involves the most depthful self-confrontations. On and on and on, as one knows who might have experienced this, and I hope never-endingly, is then a cornucopia that never stops of what transmutationally can occur from such a process. I wouldn't say a firm believer, an experiencer of this matter, that it's not a matter of my being convinced. I see the nature of it as right on. I feel my job is to keep encouraging that in myself as an individuation and also the folks around me. Now, I don't consider that that's separate from being gay, by the way. You have limitations with the lingo here, the words. Words have limits, of course. They have strengths, which is to differentiate different things. You can say them then in differentiated ways, which is strong. But also then you create false dichotomies at the same time, unfortunately. It's a challenge ongoingly. I thought I would reference that as I'm also struggling with it as I'm talking with you, but nonetheless trying to convey some of the stuff that involves what's going on here that leads up to this business of what is this band training program. So you see, I'm not describing it in the old cliche way that might be again, something that sounds very traditional and usual, because it needs this kind of background, it needs this kind of context by virtue of its unusualness, by virtue of its homo-ness, by virtue of its psychologicalness. Even it's 120 years, let's say, of psychoanalysis. As you see from the world around us, it's not a psychological society. It is an anti-psychological society. It's rabidly anti-psychological. In fact, I would argue strongly anti-psychoanalytic. That is the most serious method of psychological effort, because of its dangerousness to unjust power. That even after 120 years, what originally was conceived of as a dangerous system, it remains, or even more so, dangerous to the powers that be than before, because it provides a practical way, in my opinion, much more realistic than traditional spiritual systems, to get at the problem of unjust power personally. Through interpersonal self-confrontation of that issue as it's been embodied internally. That's the main problem, in my opinion, that needs to be tackled. And that's why in my struggles, for example, with Harry and John and Don around this issue, I saw that a very serious approach was required to get at this matter. And I had to struggle for decades to appreciate what that meant. It meant what now is in the form of this advanced training program. First, the Institute, those of us who are members, and have been running the thing, been practicing at this level for 6 years now, because for many years before that, 6 years before now, we were working at this way of being and knowing and engaging ourselves individually and each other on the level that now is called Contemporary Uranian Psychoanalysis. Okay, so how it became what it was before, now to be called Contemporary Uranian Psychoanalysis, has to do with the importance, I think, of psychoanalysis as a term, as a reference to a kind of disciplined way of approaching self-reflective subjectivity, in both individually and then vis-a-vis in a group context. That's the tradition we're referencing. I and the others are referencing, and what we're trying to do, whether or not we say so overtly. Some say this overtly, others don't, in the various schools of current psychology. But it's true of all of them, nonetheless, more or less. Though at the time that psychoanalysis began to develop, of course, it was many views about what's important and what's going on, how to approach this this matter, there were competing views as well, some of which Freud would go back to or bring further into, some of which he then repudiated later on. Oh, that's very interesting. But nonetheless, this is where it's at now. And so to consider it a methodology that we might call psychoanalytic is then to avail ourselves of how that's been approached through cultivating kind of common hermeneutic, let's call it, a common methodology that not necessarily can't have variations of it, perhaps, but has a certain value to learn, to practice as such, I tell you. And not that it's something that's fixed, not at all, but rather, for example, Doug has been at this for more than a generation, practicing it. Well, more than a generation now, huh? In a fucking hard-hitting way, you poor thing. So if he's going to share his little thing, I don't need to suggest, you see, or that would suggest that he hasn't been at this for more than a fucking generation. With blood, sweat, and tears. I'm not talking about just his own personal work, and he might come to see me individually, but damn other ways, on and on and on and on. Not even just showing up and putting forth his body, but also being engaged and confronted. He's trying to write about things, and he and I are working on it, or he and others are working on it. We go through all kinds of levels have to deal with the real things going on as we're dealing with ourselves personally, as we're dealing with it being gay, as we're dealing with whatever it is with the content we're trying to deal with. All together, I tell you, all together. Where was doing that? Where is that happening? So in a way, the Institute is kind of formalizing of this method, which is kind of a method, I don't know what to call it. Gay liberation is applied to a psychological appreciation, or a psychological appreciation applied to gay liberation. How to do that seriously? So it sounds very generic, as I mentioned, okay? But in practice, it doesn't become generic. It becomes very specific. And I speak through practice, not really because I or others are armchair people just sit in the armchair trying to contemplate whatever. No, it's not from that. This is all from actual practice and trying to work these things and live these things while we work them. And this over generation, more than a generation now. Almost 2 generations, for me personally, certainly. Poor Chrissy's been at it very long, even longer than Doug, a lot longer than Doug. It's a poor thing. Even poor Roger's been at it a long time. Okay, so that's where we're not just coming from just hot air or talking about these things. This is actually trying to seriously practice something. As we practice that, we would like to expand our little micro-community that can do this, that practices this and lives this way. We would like to expand this. We would like to invite serious interest in this. But it's a serious business to do this interest in. So it all has to go through phases of interest and involvement and development of that, and everything has to be felt out, how to work it out. So this is why we set up the club now. The way we want to do is once a month on this public interfacing. And then also we provide venues to practice gay-centered inner work, homo-centered inner work. And those seem to me the ways to expose this energy to folks in a way that then we just discover there's interest and want to be more serious about and that level of involvement. And just as I've discovered that, just as Doug has discovered that, just as Roger has discovered that, others discovered that too. You all discover that. I suppose in a way anyone who is self-developing at some point begins to discover these kind of qualities. Now, again, I want to reference that in this homo way. Where can one go if one wishes to feel an interest in honoring that? By honoring, again, there's that variety. We could say a homo version of this or that. But if one is more interested in something more integrated than that, that's the question. That's what we're trying to do here, something more integrated than that. How to do that, that's unique. There's nothing like that, whether we talk about gay rabbinic situations or a psychological situation. No one's trying to do anything like this. So it's probably not irrelevant. This is attempted in a psychological context that I'm suggesting even after 120 years to be psychologically minded is incredibly revolutionary and deeply resisted by the system that we're in for the reason that it is so threatening to them if people become too psychological. But yet, as you see, when people need to become more self-aware, to operate more and more finely in a net system, for example, you've got to be able to focus more. You have to have more focus of mind even than you have to do to drive a car, for example. How do you do that yet keep people soporific? It's a great transition into this new century that get the minds of people sharper to run a Sharper type system of how the system runs, and yet keep them soporific, as soporific as ever at the same time. How do you do that? So I look at this advanced training program as to encourage folks, whether or not anyone actually winds up participating in it, or the system of training works, or there is a training program, but just that there's an attempt to do this is an encouragement to the possibility of not merely getting sucked into that as if that's all there is. Now, if there's a possibility to put an alternative into practice in any way, on top of suggesting there is such an alternative, I'm saying just suggesting there's an alternative for those who live in a terrible desert, that's all there is really in the world I'm naming. Only a desert, there's nothing, there's no possibility, there's only being snuffed out in the sense of some homo-centered sensibility that can be respectfully honored. By respectful, again, I'm obviously giving an opinion that the gay Jew is not, that's just an oxymoron. I mean, I don't want to say when I mean to folks who would like to identify like that as a significant alternative, but I am also criticizing at the same time as compromising the two components in it. I don't find much to be gay about. I was raised as a Jew. I don't find much to be gay about in the master tradition. I'm just using this as an example, and we can turn that one around. I don't find much very Jewish about being gay, other than, again, the symbolic qualities that are in all human experience are common to all human experience and all symbols. And I don't wish to denounce that because this is the spirituality of humanism. For those of you who might be interested, when it's not so much formally God is dead, but the spirit is gone, or that a way of, it's somehow separate from being human. That God as a spiritual notion is separate from being, for those of you in the Western tradition, separate from, or influenced by monotheism, separate from being a human. That's what humanism is opposed to. Not in the sense of an opposition per se, but in the sense of criticizing it as stupid, that this is all caused by human imagination anyway. I'm not suggesting that man is the cause of God, but rather that as far as we're concerned, it's irrelevant whether it's God or not if we're not the equal of God. And I suggest we're set up that way by God, so to speak. I'm speaking metaphorically for those of you who might be frightened. So first I talk about just the notion that there could be the possibility of trying to focus more on this as a meaningfulness that could be cultivated. Again, if you were in traditional time and place, we developed in the tradition of which that's a part historically. But that's all been destroyed now. That's all been eliminated now. There is nothing like that now, even though that's a terrible thing. It does allow for the possibility of starting afresh, which is not merely bad, though that's unfortunate, that such great powers of tradition have to be renewed afresh in a time and place because of terrible Holocaust, unspeakable Holocaust, which must be spoken, of course. The hypocrites speak all the time of Holocaust they want to talk about, but they obviously never talk about those they don't approve of, as if they did not exist. And thus you see the power of the winner to say history. Those who have the power tell history, and then everything else is forgotten. It's a terrible weapon in that sense, history, as it's officially recorded by those who are able to do so. And how do we learn about that in some sense to open that up or get free of that is real important here as to why this, for example, this event's being recorded by the tape right now, so that we can cultivate some of the kind of history. Here, specifically about being gay. Now, in this time, it's called being gay, but I believe in other times and places, for example, if others see this tape 1,000 years from now or something, don't know any particulars, we'll be able to recognize common themes. So I'm not saying people 1,000 years ago were gay in the way we're calling them now, or 10,000 years ago, no. But there's a common sensibility, I want to suggest to you, that can be felt and developed and recognized if one can be brought under its spell internally enough to be a partner back to that spell and not merely be schmoozed by it one way or the other, either to dominate or be dominated by it. I'm talking about a partnership, which has to be cultivated to work. In the old days, this would be through a spiritual discipline, a serious spiritual discipline for those so-called call to that discipline or, again, profession, that are professing something, maybe in a business sense or making money sense. But now we're no longer in what we call a spiritual tradition when we want to approach these matters, because that's been too much particularized in a mythic sense that doesn't allow for the fact that the individual is the ultimate creator of all myths. There is no other creator of myths. There is no other experiencer of myths. There is no other myth. I'm going to suggest to you, in the end.